Kate, I want to start today's episode with a question, and it's not a comfortable one.
Go ahead.
If someone told you that they were going to hurt you, really, genuinely hurt you, until you gave them a name, just one name, one address, one person, and then it all stops, what do? Because most of us, if we're honest, would probably break. Eventually.
Most people would. The psychological research on coercive interrogation is pretty clear on that. Given enough time and enough pain, most human beings will say something, anything, just to make it stop.
So what does it take to be the exception?
That is exactly what today's episode is about, because we are going to cover 5 women, 5 different countries, 5 different stories. And in every single case, the Gestapo, the SS, or the Wehrmacht threw everything they had at these women and got absolutely nothing back.
A spy, a librarian, a princess, a teenage girl, and a student.
None of them were hardened soldiers. None of them had years of military conditioning. What they had was something that the people torturing them could never manufacture and never destroy. And today, we're going to understand exactly what that was.
This is WW2 with George and Kate, and this is the episode I think you need to hear. All right, let's start in France, 1942. And Kate, I want you to set the scene because I think people underestimate how dangerous occupied France actually was for someone running a spy network.
People really do underestimate it. So by 1942, the German occupation of France is 2 years old, and the apparatus of repression is running at full speed. The Gestapo, the secret state police, has embedded informant networks throughout every major city. The Abwehr, which is German military intelligence, is running counter-espionage operations, specifically targeting Allied agents. The Milice, which is the French fascist paramilitary, is actively hunting resistance members on behalf of the Germans. And on top of all of that, there are ordinary citizens, George, who are scared, who have hungry families, who might report a suspicious neighbor for a bag of flour.
So the environment is basically trust nobody.
Trust absolutely nobody. And into this environment, the British Special Operations Executive, Churchill's sabotage and intelligence organization, the one he personally ordered to set Europe ablaze, is parachuting agents into France, courier agents, radio operators, network leaders, and they are being captured and rolled up faster than the SOE can replace them.
Which is where Odette comes in.
Which is where Odette Sansom comes in. And George, her background is worth understanding because it tells you a lot about why she ended up there. She was born Odette Briley in Amiens, France in 1912, grew up in France, moved to England as a young woman, married an English hotelier named Roy Sansom, had 3 daughters. When the war started, her husband volunteered for the army. He was killed. She was a widow in her mid-30s with 3 young girls living in Somerset, and she answered a BBC radio broadcast.
Wait, she answered a radio broadcast?
The BBC put out an appeal asking French nationals living in Britain to submit photographs of the French coastline, old holiday photographs, postcards, anything that might help military planners understand the terrain. Odette sent in some photographs. A clerical error routed her response to the War Office instead of the BBC, and the SOE noticed her.
And thought, we need this woman.
Well, not immediately. They interviewed her, they ran her through training, and her initial assessments were mixed. Her trainers flagged her as impulsive, potentially too emotional for covert work. Her file said she might not be temperamentally suited for a field role. But by 1942, the SOE needed French-speaking couriers desperately. So in November 1942, they gave her a code name, Lise, and they dropped her into occupied France.
By parachute, as a mother of 3.
By parachute, into the dark, in the middle of the night, into enemy-occupied territory. She linked up with the Spindle Network, led by a man named Peter Churchill, codename Raoul, and their radio operator Arnaud Rabinowitsch. And for months, Odette worked as courier, running messages, smuggling intelligence, moving between contacts, all while Gestapo informants crawled through every cafe and boarding house in southern France.
And the man hunting them, Hugo Bleicher.
Hugo Bleicher. Now, I want to spend a moment on Bleicher because he is not some cartoon villain. He was brilliant. He was a sergeant in the Abwehr, which was unusual. Most of his peers were officers, and he had a gift for psychological manipulation. He didn't just arrest agents, he infiltrated networks. He turned captured agents into double agents. He used patience and subtlety to pick apart entire organizations from the inside. By 1943, he had dismantled networks that were bigger than Spindle, and he had his eyes on Peter Churchill's operation.
So Odette knew this man was circling.
She knew, and she kept going. And here is the detail that I find extraordinary. Before her capture, Odette had constructed a cover story, a lie so audacious that it sounds like something from a film. She told people that she and Peter Churchill were married, and not just married, she claimed Peter Churchill was the nephew of Winston Churchill himself, the British Prime Minister.
That's not true.
Completely false. Peter Churchill had absolutely no relation to Winston Churchill. It was a coincidence of surnames and nothing more. But Odette had calculated that if she and Peter were ever captured, the Gestapo might hesitate to execute someone who could be a political bargaining chip with the British leadership. It was insurance, and the gamble was partially right.
How were they caught?
April 1943, a hotel in St. Joris. Bleicher closed the trap. Both Odette and Peter Churchill were arrested, and Peter Churchill survived the war partly because of Odette's lie. The Gestapo genuinely half believed the Winston Churchill connection and held him back from execution. Meanwhile, Odette was taken to Friends prison outside Paris.
And this is where I need everyone listening to understand what happened next, because it is hard to hear.
It is. The Gestapo's interrogation of Odette at Friends had one goal: get her to talk. Give us the names, give us the safe houses, give us the couriers, and we stop. Simple. And when she refused to answer their questions, they pulled out all 10 of her toenails, one by one.
Ugh.
All 10.
She screamed.
She screamed. She was a human being, not a machine. Of course she screamed, but she named no one, not one person, not one address, not one contact. Through that entire process, silence. And she told them the same lie she'd told everyone else. She and Peter Churchill were married. He was Winston's nephew, and she knew nothing about networks. She was just a wife visiting her husband in France.
And Bleicher, this brilliant counterintelligence officer, he half believed her.
He started smuggling food to her cell, George. The man who caught her was bringing her food because he couldn't entirely rule out the Winston Churchill connection and wanted to cover his own position. She had psychologically outmaneuvered him from inside a torture chamber after having her toenails torn out.
I genuinely don't know what to do with that information.
And it gets heavier, because when the Gestapo realized they would get nothing from Odette, they sent her to Ravensbrück concentration camp in Germany. And at Ravensbrück, her cell was placed directly opposite the crematorium. Every single night, the ashes from the crematorium blew through her cell window. She knew what those ashes were. She was starved, she watched friends die, some gassed, some shot, and she held on.
For how long?
Until liberation in 1945, and after the war, she didn't go home and stay quiet. She traveled to the Nuremberg trials and testified against the commandant of Ravensbrück, Fritz Surin, with the kind of clear-eyed precision that put him in the dock. He was later executed for war crimes.
She looked the man in the eye at Nuremberg.
And told the court exactly what he'd done. She was awarded the George Cross, the first woman to receive it under fire. The French gave her the Légion d'honneur. She briefly married Peter Churchill after the war, and she lived until 1995, George, 82 years old.
She outlived everyone.
She outlived the Gestapo officers who interrogated her. She outlived Friends prison. She outlived the Reich itself by 50 years.
And that final detail, Bleicher smuggling her food because he half believed the Winston Churchill story. While her toenails were gone, she was running a psychological operation from inside a torture chamber.
She never stopped thinking. That is the truth of Odette Sansom. Even in the worst moment of her life, she was already 5 moves ahead of the man across the table.
Okay, We are going to move from occupied France to occupied Lithuania. In this story, Kate, this one hits me differently because it is not a trained spy. It is not someone with SOE backing or a code name or a parachute drop. It is a librarian.
Ona Shimaite. And to understand her story, you have to understand Vilnius in 1941. Because what happened in that city in the second half of 1941 is among the most concentrated mass atrocities of the entire war.
This is the German invasion of the Soviet Union.
Operation Barbarossa launches June 22, 1941. Within days, German forces are tearing through the Baltic states. Vilnius, which had been part of Soviet-occupied Lithuania since 1940, falls almost immediately, and behind the Wehrmacht come the Einsatzgruppen, mobile killing units, and their specific mandate was the Jewish population.
And Vilnius had a large Jewish community.
One of the most significant in all of Europe, Vilnius had been called the Jerusalem of Lithuania for centuries, a deep, rich, ancient Jewish cultural heritage, scholars, writers, musicians, rabbis. And between June and December 1941, the Einsatzgruppen and their local collaborators murdered over 30,000 Jewish civilians at a site called Paneri, just outside the city. 30,000 people in 6 months. The remaining Jewish population, roughly 40,000 people, were forced into a ghetto, 2 sections of the old city sealed off with walls and wire, overcrowded, starving, systematically stripped of everything of value.
And Ona Shimaite was a librarian at Vilnius University.
Mid-40s, Lithuanian. She had worked at the university library for years, and she had Jewish students, brilliant young students whose lives had been erased by the occupation, and Ona could not stand it.
How did she get in?
She found a legitimate reason: university books. Some of her students had checked out library books before the ghetto was sealed. Those books still belonged to the university. She petitioned the German authorities for permission to enter the ghetto to collect the overdue books. And the Germans, with characteristic bureaucratic rigidity, gave her a pass. After all, rules are rules.
And then she used that pass
To run a supply line. Every time Ona walked into the ghetto with her book bag, she was also carrying bread, medicine, cash, whatever she could get her hands on. Every time she walked out, she was carrying Yiddish manuscripts, ghetto diaries, cultural documents, the irreplaceable written memory of a community being erased in real time. She understood that killing the people and destroying the records was double annihilation. She wasn't just feeding bodies, she was saving souls.
She was preserving what they were trying to erase.
And she was hiding people. She hid Jews in her own apartment, George, at a time when sheltering a Jewish person was a death sentence. She built a network, local contacts, sympathetic Lithuanians, people who would take documents, pass food, hide children. And she did this for 2 years. 2 years of daily Gestapo checks at the ghetto gates, 2 years of walking past German soldiers with a bag full of contraband, 2 years of knowing that if anyone talked, it was over.
And eventually, someone did.
March 1944, she was arrested. And the Gestapo, when they realized the scale of what she'd been doing, the network she'd built, the people she'd sheltered, the documents she'd smuggled, they were furious, and they interrogated her for 12 days straight.
12 days.
12 consecutive days of beatings, and I want to be specific here because it matters. They cracked her bones, George. The physical damage to her body was permanent. And she revealed nothing, not a single name of a person she'd hidden, not a single contact in her network, not one address.
12 days with broken bones.
And she gave them nothing. She was deported, first processed through Dachau, then sent to a subcamp at Flossenburg in France, where she was forced into hard labor under conditions that would have killed many people. She contracted typhus, she came close to dying from the disease alone, and yet she was liberated in 1945.
And then she just stayed in France?
She never returned to Lithuania, And this is the bitter postscript to her story that I think deserves to be spoken out loud. After the war, Lithuania was absorbed into the Soviet Union, and under the Soviet system, someone like Ona, educated in a bourgeois university, connected to Western intellectual circles, who had preserved Jewish cultural heritage, was not a hero. She was viewed with suspicion. The Soviet state had absolutely no interest in honoring a Lithuanian woman who had risked everything for a Jewish community. The ideology didn't fit the narrative.
So she was erased twice, once by the Nazis and once by the Soviets.
In a sense, Israel eventually recognized her as righteous among the nations, one of the highest honors given to non-Jews who risked their lives to save Jews during the Holocaust. But she died in France in 1970 in relative obscurity. And she left behind letters, George. And in one of those letters, she explained everything about herself in a single sentence.
The one you mentioned before.
She wrote, "I could not stand idle while innocents died." No ideology, no grand speech, just she could not be idle.
That might be the most honest thing anyone says in this entire episode.
I think it might be.
All right, we are going back to France, 1943. And this story, Kate, every time I read about Noor Inayat Khan, I have the same reaction, the same thought. The thought is, there is no way this is a real person. This is too much. Someone made this up.
I know exactly what you mean. Because on paper, everything about Noor Inayat Khan screams, wrong person for this job. And yet she did the job better than almost anyone the SOE ever sent into the field.
Who was she?
So Noor was born in Moscow in 1914. Her father was Hazrat Inayat Khan, an Indian Sufi musician and spiritual teacher, highly respected across Europe and America, who believed in a universal mystical brotherhood across all religions and cultures. Her mother was American. Noor grew up between London and Paris. She was deeply spiritual, a practicing Sufi. She was a pacifist. Not in a passive way, but in a principled, philosophical way. She genuinely did not believe in violence as a means to any end.
A pacifist who ends up as a spy in occupied France.
A pacifist who ends up as a spy in occupied France. But here's the thing. When the war started and France fell, Noor could not stand idle, to echo Ona Shamaiti. She volunteered for the Women's Auxiliary Air Force. She trained as a wireless operator because it was the most useful technical skills she could acquire. And the SOE noticed her language abilities. She spoke French fluently. She understood French culture and recruited her.
And her evaluations were not great.
Her evaluations were mixed, to be diplomatic. Her trainers wrote that she was impulsive, that she was too emotional for the work, that she might crack under pressure. Her file contained phrases like, not temperamentally suited for a field role. These were people who had observed her in training exercises, in simulated arrest scenarios, and concluded she was not hardened enough.
And they sent her anyway.
Because the Paris networks had been decimated. It was June 1943. The SOE had poured agents into France, and the Gestapo had rolled them up one by one. They had almost no functioning wireless operators left in Paris, and without radio operators, the networks were blind. London couldn't communicate, couldn't receive intelligence, couldn't coordinate. They needed Noor, codename Nurse, also known as Madeline. She was one of the smallest, most unassuming people the SOE had ever trained. She carried a bulky wireless set into Paris on a night drop.
And then within 2 months...
Within 2 months of her arrival, almost every other agent in her network had been arrested. The Gestapo's counterintelligence operation was devastatingly effective that summer. London saw what was happening and ordered Noor to abort. Come home, get out now, this network is gone. And she refused.
She refused a direct order.
She refused to leave because she calculated, correctly, that if she left, there would be no wireless link to London from Paris at all. The entire city would go dark. And so she stayed, George, alone. the last functioning SOE operator in Paris, moving her wireless set between safe houses every single day, sometimes twice a day, because the Germans had radio detection vans trolling the streets. They could triangulate a transmission in under 20 minutes. She knew this, and she transmitted anyway, for nearly 2 months, feeding London intelligence that no one else could provide.
How did they finally catch her?
A traitor. A woman in the network named Renee Gary gave Noor's address to the Gestapo in October 1943. The motive appears to have been personal, jealousy, a grudge. Noor was betrayed by someone from her own side. She was arrested, and at this point, the Gestapo had a significant problem because Noor immediately tried to escape, twice. She tried to crawl out through the roof of the building where she was being held. She had to be physically restrained both times. So the Germans classified her as extremely dangerous and transferred her to Portsheim prison in Germany, not as a regular prisoner of war, but under a special category that essentially meant treat with maximum security.
And this is where the 10 months begin.
10 months of solitary confinement. Chains on her wrists and ankles, not temporarily, George, but continuously. She was shackled in her cell. She was starved. She was beaten during interrogations. The Germans were convinced she had network contacts, safe house addresses, agent names stored in that head of hers, and they tried every tool they had to get them out. She told them nothing. Not one name, not one address, not one contact.
10 months in chains.
And she scratched notes on the walls of her cell, little morale messages to herself in whatever language she could use, French, English, little philosophical notes about endurance and meaning. The Sufism her father had given her was in her bones. And her codebook, George, before her arrest, the last thing she did as a free person was destroy it entirely. She burned the book that contained the encryption keys for her transmissions, knowing that if the Gestapo got those codes, they could use them to send fake messages to London, to burn every agent who received them.
She burned the one thing that might have bought her clemency.
She chose other people's safety over her own. And in September 1944, 11 months after her arrest, she and 3 other SOE women were transferred to Dachau, and an SS officer took them to the back of the compound and shot each of them in the back of the head. Noor Inayat Khan was 30 years old.
And her last word?
According to a surviving witness who was present, her last word was liberté.
Freedom, in French, on her knees.
In Dachau, from a woman who had spent 10 months in chains.
A pacifist who would not fire a weapon, who chose the most dangerous posting in occupied Europe, who held it alone for 2 months, who refused to leave when ordered, who burned the one thing that could have saved her, and still, at the very last moment,
meant it. It wasn't theater. It wasn't defiance for the crowd. There was no crowd. There was just Noor and the truth of what she believed.
She was awarded the Croix de Guerre and the George Cross posthumously, and today there's a statue of her in London, in Gordon Square.
There is, and her family, for years after the war, didn't widely publicize her Muslim faith, her Indian heritage, her Sufi background, out of fear that those things would be used to diminish what she'd done, as if somehow the princess label or the pacifist label made her sacrifice less serious, less legitimate.
The wrong kind of hero.
The wrong kind for the expectations of the time, but there is no wrong kind of courage.
I want to stop for a second before we go to the next story, because I need to say something. Odette was in her 30s. Ona was in her 40s. Noor was 30. And the next two, Kate, the next two are children.
Yes, and I want everyone listening to hold that. Because Lepa Radic was 17 years old, and everything that happened to her happened to a 17-year-old.
Tell us who she was.
Lepa Radic, born 1925 in Bosnia, then part of the Kingdom of Yugoslavia. And in 1941, the Axis powers tore Yugoslavia apart. The Germans, the Italians, the Hungarians, and the Bulgarian forces all carved out occupation zones. And in the Croatian territory, which included much of Bosnia, the Nazis installed a puppet fascist regime called the Ustaše. And the Ustaše were savage. Mass executions of Serbs, Jews, and Roma. Entire villages burned. It was one of the most brutal occupation regimes in all of Europe. Estimates suggest the Ustaše murdered hundreds of thousands of people.
And out of this carnage, the Yugoslav partisans.
Josip Broz Tito's partisans, the communist-led resistance movement that became the most militarily effective internal resistance force in all of occupied Europe. They fought in the mountains, ambushed German convoys, tied down entire divisions that Hitler needed elsewhere. And Lepa Radic joined them at 15.
15.
She didn't fight with a rifle initially. She worked as a nurse, tending to wounded partisan fighters, which sounds safer than combat, but wasn't, because moving wounded people through Nazi-occupied territory was extraordinarily dangerous. These were people who couldn't walk quickly, who needed cover, who needed supplies that you had to smuggle through checkpoints.
And in early 1943, everything came to a head.
February 1943, the Germans launched Operation Case White, one of the largest anti-partisan offensives of the entire war. They committed roughly 150,000 troops, Wehrmacht, SS, Italian forces, and their collaborators, specifically to destroy Tito's partisan army. And the partisans, in response, had to do the impossible. They had to evacuate thousands of wounded soldiers through the mountains of Bosnia in the middle of winter while being pursued by 150,000 soldiers on multiple sides. It is known today as the Battle of the Neretva. And Lepa Radic was part of the evacuation force responsible for moving over 100 wounded partisans to safety.
And she was captured while doing that.
Captured while trying to get the wounded out. The Germans who seized her knew immediately what they had, a young female partisan clearly embedded in the network who had to know names, routes, safe locations, other fighters. So they did what they did. In Bosanska Krupa, over 3 days, they whipped her, burned her, and electrocuted her for 3 days.
She was 17.
17 years old. And when they asked her for names, she looked at them and said, "Only my name.
My name.
That is all you are getting from me, my name." And after 3 days of getting nothing, they decided to execute her publicly. They wanted to make an example. They wanted the civilian population of that region to see what happened to partisans. So they held the hanging in the town square.
In front of 10,000 people.
They gathered roughly 10,000 soldiers, civilians, local collaborators. They wanted it to be a lesson that no one would forget. And as the noose was placed around Lepa Radic's neck, she turned to face the crowd and she shouted, "Partisans, long live freedom!"
In front of 10,000 people.
And then the truck lurched forward, and Lepa Radic, 17 years old, 3 days of torture that would have broken most adults, was gone.
And the Germans hid her body.
They dumped her in a pit. They were afraid of a gravesite. They understood, with some instinct, that a grave would become a place of pilgrimage, a symbol, a monument. So they hid the body, but they could not erase what those 10,000 people witnessed with their own eyes.
And post-war?
People's hero of Yugoslavia, the highest honor the country gave. Monuments were built, streets named after her. But the image that endured, there is a photograph taken of Lepa shortly before her execution. She is looking directly into the camera, George. She knows what is coming. She knows. And the expression on her face is not fear. It is not resignation. It is a blazing, defiant fury, like she is daring the camera to look away first.
She had already won.
She had won. They got nothing from her. 3 days, a 17-year-old body, everything they could do, and she gave them her name and nothing else.
And finally, Moscow. November 1941. And Kate, before we talk about Zoya, I need people to understand just how dark November 1941 was for the Soviet Union, because I think it's important context.
November 1941 is arguably the most desperate month in Soviet history during the entire war. And that is saying something because there were many desperate months. The Wehrmacht had launched the drive toward Moscow in October, Operation Typhoon, and they were getting close. The front lines were within 50 miles of Moscow in places. Government ministries had been evacuated east to the Ural Mountains. There were reports of Stalin himself briefly considering fleeing the city. The Moscow metro was operating as a command bunker. The city was shaking.
And yet, Stalin stayed.
Stalin stayed. And in that atmosphere of desperate last stands, the Soviet command began deploying partisan sabotage teams behind German lines. Young volunteers, many of them students, Komsomol members, ideologically committed young people, were given missions to burn German supply depots, cut communications, disrupt the rear area. Small missions. Individually, each one barely moved the needle, but collectively, they were meant to tie down German forces, slow logistics, and, perhaps most importantly, show the Soviet people that the fight had not stopped.
And Zoya volunteered.
Zoya Kosmodemyanskaya was 18 years old, a Moscow student, and she volunteered for one of these sabotage units in November 1941. Her mission? Infiltrate the village of Petroshevo, roughly 100 kilometers southwest of Moscow, which the Germans were using as a rear area base. Burn the stables, destroy the horses the Germans were using for supply transport and logistics, cut their communications, and get out.
And she carried out the mission.
She did. She got into the village, she burned the stables, and she was caught on her second attempt because she went back, George. After completing part of the mission, she returned to finish the job, and on her second approach, she was seized by German soldiers and, according to some accounts, by local collaborators who had spotted her.
Were there villages who helped the Germans catch her?
There were, and it is one of the most uncomfortable parts of the story. Some local residents were collaborating with the occupiers, not necessarily out of ideology, but out of fear, out of survival instinct. And that complexity is worth holding, not to excuse them, but to understand the kind of crushing fear that occupation created in ordinary people.
And the Germans who caught her
Were angry. They had just watched their supply infrastructure go up in flames. So that night, in the village of Petroshevo, they interrogated Zoya Kosmodemyanskaya. And interrogated does not capture what that word meant here. She was stripped in below freezing temperatures. She was lashed, the accounts say, over 300 times. She was marched barefoot through the snow in temperatures that can reach below zero in that region in November. They pressed burning coals against her feet.
300 lashes.
And barefoot in Russian winter snow. And she told them nothing. No names, no unit locations, no information about the sabotage network or how many more teams were operating behind German lines. She even refused to give her real name. She told them her name was Tanya.
She gave them a false name during all of that.
Still running a disinformation operation from inside the worst night of her life. That is who Zoya Kosmodemyanskaya was.
And the next morning?
November 29th, 1941. They hanged her in the village square. German soldiers ringed the gallows. Some were jeering. And before the trapdoor dropped, Zoya Kosmodemyanskaya shouted to the watching crowd of villagers, "You can hang me, but you cannot hang all 190 million of us."
All 190 million.
The entire population of the Soviet Union. Not "I will be avenged," not "we will win," just "you can kill me and it will not matter, because there are 190 million more of us, and you cannot hang us all."
That is not the speech of someone who is broken.
That is the speech of someone who won. She was 18 years old, and then they hanged her. And here's the detail that turned her death into something that reshaped the war at a national level. A Soviet war correspondent arrived in the village days later and photographed her body, still hanging at the gallows where the Germans had left it as a warning. And those photographs were published, shown to the Soviet public, not hidden, not sanitized, shown.
That seems like a risk. Showing your own people that the Nazis are hanging teenage girls?
It was a calculated risk that paid off enormously, because the reaction across the Soviet Union was not demoralization, it was rage. It was the kind of cold, white-hot fury that turns frightened people into soldiers. Stalin used her name in speeches. She became the first woman awarded the Hero of the Soviet Union during the war. Her image appeared in recruitment posters, in poems, in films, in school textbooks. Her name was taught to every Soviet child for decades.
And her mother?
Her mother, Lyubov Kosmodemyanskaya, traveled to Petroshevo after the war to identify her daughter's body, which had been buried in a mass grave. And when she saw her daughter, she said, "My daughter endured this for all of us."
That is frankly unspeakable.
She outlived her daughter by decades, and she spent the rest of her life speaking about Zoya.